In this lesson, we'll continue to look at some of the attributes that are responsible for the overall behavior of your particles. Okay, so right where we left off in our previous lesson, we have our particle emitter that we've built and is now spewing out some particles. Now, one of the things that we need to do at this point is to try to get these particles moving along with the rest of the hose. Now, we're going to do this really in a very simple way. We don't really want to try to animate the movement of this emitter to match up with the hose. But what we can do is take the existing animation from the bones that Delano used to animate this hose and actually just take this emitter and parent it right to those bones. So that way as the bones are moving this hose around, it's also going to move this emitter. So to do this, let's go to the Show menu and let's turn on Joints. So that way we can actually grab this joint here. There we are. Now, sometimes once you turn on these joints, it starts to become a little bit difficult to try to select anything in front of or behind these joints. A lot of times Maya tends to give selection priority to these joints, although sometimes you may get lucky, in my case. So what is sometimes going to be useful is to just use your selection masks. So if you find that your joints are getting in the way of selecting your emitter, let's just turn off our joint selection masks, and that way no joints can be selected. We can easily come in and grab this emitter now. So now with this emitter selected, let's turn my joint mask back on. And again, with this emitter selected, Shift select this first bone. And now let's go to Edit and then Parent, which means now this bone is the parent of this emitter. Which also means now as this bone moves, it should take that emitter right along with it. There we go. Very nice. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the movement of this emitter. Now really I don't want this emitter to start to spew out these particles until the hose really busts away right about this point. So that's going to be right about frame 115 or so. So let's come in and start to change some of the particle behavior. We can actually animate a lot of these values to get us the result that we want. Now, if we take a look at the emitter itself, the attribute that we want to control is this rate. Now, the rate, like the name suggests, really controls how many particles are coming out of this hose here, or out of the emitter. As we start to bring this rate up, we should start to see a lot more particles coming out of this. As we start to bring our rate down, we should see almost a non-existent trail of particles. So the first thing we need to do is find a value that is going to work for us as far as the overall particle rate. Now, as I showed you, we can start to bring this particle rate up and start to get more particles in here. Although sometimes when you start to get a situation like mine where we have these really fast-moving particles, you're really going to have to bring this rate up very, very high to start to get a nice, decent coverage of particles so we don't wind up with some of these odd gaps and things like that. Another option that we have here is this option to scale rate by speed. And sometimes what this will let us do is use a much lower value, and it does a much better job of filling in these areas where we have lots and lots of high movement of particles. Okay, so let's try bumping this up to maybe something like 4 or even 3. There we go. So that should work out pretty well. So this rate of 4 with a scale rate by speed, again, this should work out pretty well for us. Now, what we need to do is keyframe this so that the particles don't start to emit until right around frame 115 or so. So let's go to frame 115, and with this rate set to 4, let's right-click and set key. Now let's go to one frame before this, frame 114, and we'll set the particle rate down to 0. Again, right-click and set key. So that way, the timeline up to this point, we have an emission rate of 0, which means there are no particles emitting. And then once we hit frame 115, the particle emission rate goes up to 4, which means we start to spew out particles at that point. If we play this back, you can see exactly what we get. No particles. And then, there we go. Once that hose breaks away, we start to get a nice flood of particles. Now, looking at this, you can start to see that there is another part of the puzzle that is missing, and that is right now, these particles just sort of live forever. There's really no controls that are killing these particles. Now that's a really bad thing because a lot of times these particles will almost never live forever. So let's come in and start to change this behavior. So we're going to get into the emitter, and this time we're going to look at the particle shape. Now the particle shape is where we can start to control how long these particles live. So at the moment, you can see that the lifespan mode is set to live forever. What we could do is set this to something like a constant, and now at this point, we are deciding the lifespan based on seconds. So right now the lifespan is set to 1, which means the particles will live for 1 second and then start to die. So as we play this through, you can see now, again, once these particles have existed in space for about 1 second or about 24 frames, they will start to die off. Now, one of the problems that we start to get with that is that it starts to look maybe a little bit too regular, a little bit too even, because you can see we get just sort of this nice little clean break in our particles where they're all dying about the same point. So a lot of times what I like to use is this random range, where we still have control over the lifespan, but now we can have a little bit more of a random factor to this. So again, right now we have the particles set to live for 1 second, but if we adjust, let's say, a random of 0.5, that means these particles may live for basically half a second above or below this value. So with this as your base, particles may start to die off at half a second, or they may start to die off at 1.5 seconds. So now if I rewind this back, play through, we should see now a much more natural sort of uneven decay and dying of our particles. That's much, much better. Okay, very nice. Now the values that you use for your particular scenes and your particular particles may be very, very different from mine. Every situation or every scene is a little bit different. So understanding these different particle attributes and knowing exactly what it is that they do is going to be really, really important if you want to be able to use these in your own scenes for controlling exactly how fast your particles are moving, how long they live, and really just what sort of behavior they're going to have. So at this point, we are really at a point where we can have a pretty good overall behavior of our particles. One thing, though, is that maybe these particles do seem a little bit sort of narrow and confined. So what I might do on mine is start to bring this spread up just a little bit higher. So that way we start to get more of a kind of a gaseous sort of spread in these particles. It's a little bit better. I might even bring that up a little bit higher. So that way we get, again, kind of a nice little spread of these particles. So what I'm going for is something that is maybe a little bit more, again, kind of gaseous, a little bit more cloudy, sort of like liquid oxygen or compressed gas that's fueling this aircraft. Okay, so now that we have this set up, what we'll start to do in our next lesson is start to focus on the rendered appearance of these particles.